Welcome to Lunch Money episode 69. We are your online and social media home for corporate workouts, special situations and capital raising professionals. My name is Nick Samios. I am the fund manager here at Hermes Capital and I am your Lunch Money host. We've got a very exciting guest today. I'm going to introduce him right away. He is Mike House. G'day, Mike. How are you doing?
I'm well, thanks, Nick. How are you?
I'm very well indeed, Mike. You are a trusted 20-year veteran of survival instruction and change management. I'm pretty sure you're sitting in Perth and I'm in Sydney here, and we just talked about how lucky you are to be living large. But I have seen you speak somewhere in Perth, and I'm not sure. It was at a conference, and I just don't remember which one it was. But tell me, what has been keeping you busy this past week? What does a day in the life of Mike House look like?
There's a lot of variety in it these days, Nick. So over the last week, I've been working with a couple of major government agencies on some emergency response stuff at a state level, which has been pretty interesting. Doing a little bit of work with a couple of executive teams just around how do we deal with the levels of uncertainty in the mix at the moment, and there's plenty of that going on. And then a little bit of one-on-one coaching with a few senior leaders as well. So it's been a pretty diverse and interesting week.
So you work with government and corporates. I mean, what does your typical client look like?
So there's again, it's pretty diverse. It's probably the easiest bucket is leadership teams. But I do stuff across government agencies. I've got a few publicly listed businesses in the mix, a number of private firms, and then part of my background as well was working in not-for-profit in the change management space. So got a number of not-for-profit agencies that I work with as well.
And what are some of the challenges that, say, a not-for-profit would face in terms of change management? What does that mean in the not-for-profit space?
Right at the minute, particularly in disability and aged care, I'm sure you've seen some of the media there around the National Disability Insurance Scheme and royal commissions into aged care and into disability. They're in a very, very interesting world at the moment. So they've gone from a environment of very, very certain funding that came in every sort of 6 months or quarterly or annually, depending on funding program. And so not much need to actively get out and hustle for business. And in the new environment, funding's attached to individuals, and individuals have a high degree of control over how it gets spent. So they're in a totally different commercial reality to what they've been used to. And for many of them, it's causing real tension to grab easy cash flow rather than to be really clear about purpose and trajectory. And particularly the older organisations, some of them are really wrestling with that at the moment. And, it's territory that commercial space has been playing in forever, but it's a very, very different reality for them.
Now, you've made the journey from outdoor survival training, which you were doing for 20 years, and you've then taken that into change management and leadership. So tell me a little bit about, what your life was as a survival trainer and how those learnings translate to that change management scenario.
Yeah, great question. So my pinnacle job as a survival instructor, we used to run a 10-day program where a group of around 8 to 10 people would walk 200 kilometres in the Pilbara. That's 1,800 odd k's north of Perth. Arid area, very, very harsh, hot in the summertime, cold in the wintertime, and very dry. And they'd walk that 200 k's with a soapbox-sized survival kit, a couple of litres of water to start, and whatever clothes they were standing up in. And my job really was to keep on shaking the cage, to get them as unsettled and uncertain as possible and create as much duress as possible. So that was a lot of fun. I'm the bastard behind the scenes, pulling the levers to make life hard. And what I realised one day, it was actually some of the inspiration behind my first book, which is Thrive and Adapt, up the back here. I was sitting on a rock out in the Pilbara once, and I realised that the work I was doing in change management and the work I was doing in survival was actually the same type of work. It was just pushing and pulling in different directions. So in survival, my job was to create the uncertainty, and in change management, it's like, how can I create a sense of certainty when everything's moving? And I think that that's a really, the topic of my second book, Unshakable, is really how can leaders create a sense of certainty that's internal to the organisation and the teams in it, and to some degree the individuals, when everything around is quite unpredictable and shifting and changing. And in many ways, we can't know all the answers. And really that comes down to, it's a lot about mindset and how we interact with each other at a leadership level and an engagement level, rather than looking to the circumstances for certainty.
It's interesting, when you talk about trekking 200 kilometres through the Pilbara. I mean, when you say through the Pilbara, I mean, it's more like on the Pilbara. I mean, the Pilbara, it's not, you're not going through anything, are you? I mean, it's a lot of red rock and dirt. Did you ever nearly lose anybody? And, I mean, it is survival training, so there must be times when people think that they're on their last ever training course.
That's a great question. That it's every now and then people would say, "What's your success rate as a survival instructor?" And I think if it wasn't 100%, it'd be false advertising, really. You can imagine leaping out of the bushes with 10 people saying, "G'day, I'm Mick, your survival instructor. I've got a 98% success rate." It wouldn't go down too well.
Yeah.
So their experience of how much duress they were under was probably greater than what they actually were. In that environment, it's really important to keep people safe and to bring them home. So my job was to kind of push those levels of things like fatigue, duress, hydration, as far as was safe, but no further than that. But I've certainly been myself and around other people that have been in situations where death could potentially be an outcome of what you're currently doing, and that's certainly pretty interesting space. I've faced a few situations where I thought I wasn't going to make it through, so they're pretty interesting in terms of the sort of psychology of that.
Wow, it's interesting. You talk there. You said that people, I'm imagining that I'm on one of your courses, and we're traipsing through the desert, and I think I'm about to die. You said that there's this perception of how much duress you're under versus how much duress you're really under. And I'm wondering if that's sort of a book chapter or something, because I'm wondering, going through this pandemic, we think it's terrible to some extent. There's a lot of stuff that is terrible, but it's part of coping with it, actually making the realization of, it's how bad it really is versus how bad it really isn't. If I've probably expressed that
look,
better.
there's a big piece, Nick, in how we perceive things, where human beings are machines of perception, really. So how we experience our reality is largely what happens between our ears. It's a lot of it's in our head, and how we frame our perception and how we're able to shift it is actually a really essential skill. And I know in your promo for this, in the conversation we had leading up to, we were talking about the Stockdale Paradox. So, Stockdale was a prisoner of war during the Vietnam era, and Jim Collins brought his story really into the spotlight in his book, Good to Great. And, Stockdale spoke about this need to balance an absolute unshakable optimism or faith in the fact that you would prevail in the end, with a need to confront the brutal facts of your reality, whatever they might be. And I think one of the games that we need to get really, really good at in this kind of space is to fully acknowledge what the potential consequences of what we're facing are. And that's not always pretty. I know here in Perth, there are businesses in some sectors that are still really struggling. Generally, our economy is doing pretty well, but there are some businesses really, really struggling. It's like they're hanging on to the monkey bar, and it's like, how long can I hold? And at what point should I let go? For them to ignore the fact that they're in fairly dire circumstances would be foolish. It's not good strategy to just go, she'll be right, we'll get through this. Blind optimism is actually quite dangerous. But you don't want to lose track of the fact that we can get through it. So part of that's about taking a broader view. We can look back on the arc of human history and go, unprecedented was a word that got trotted around a lot last year. Yeah. And I don't believe it actually is unprecedented. There's been plenty of times through human history where the world, or the majority of it, has been involved in really dire situations. It's just this happens to be the first one in living memory.
Yeah.
So you kind of take that long view, and there's plenty of evidence that we get through stuff.
Well, when you say unprecedented, unprecedented would be buzz bombs flying into London in 1944, yes. Or, the Germans sort of breaking through Belgium. It's, there is certainly an element of context there. I'm interested, you talk about businesses, hanging on the monkey bars there, which, and I know you've got that in Perth. Believe me, here on the East Coast, in Victoria and New South Wales, and obviously in particular, it's pretty dire. One of the interesting scenarios, we've got this thing where I was looking at some stats yesterday, actually, or the day before, and I actually created some charts. I should have had them ready for today, but we're looking at the number that I was graphing corporate restructuring, for the last 5 years. And it's taken a huge dive. There hasn't been a lot of business failure in the last 12 months because there's been the government support and the banks have not been taking any action, etc. But there you have businesses that are business owners at the best of times stick their head in the sand, and that's I'm sure that's a well-studied phenomenon by someone like yourself. But right now they're living in this sort of air, they're getting, no one's chasing them. The banks don't want to be seen to be chasing businesses. The ATO is not chasing them. They're getting Job Saver or Job Keeper or whatever it might be. How do you approach that? But at some point, the gate's going to come up and the bull's going to come charging into the ring. How do you talk to someone in that scenario?
So I think for me, it's about that realistic assessment of what you face. And one of the challenges for humans is that we like certainty. So that means that we tend to make stories up to fill the gaps. If we don't know enough about what's going on, we fill those gaps. And it's smart, I think, to be really very realistic about what's happening. And I know you had a conversation with Michael Ford from Castaway Forecasting a few weeks back, and he and I have lots of interesting conversations about scenario planning and forecasting. None of that stuff is about trying to predict the future, because inevitably the scenarios you hatch will be somehow deviant from what actually happens. But the process of mentally unpacking what's the absolute worst case scenario and how would I deal with it, and then what are some variations on that.
Well, can I just put a place mark in that, because that is beautiful what you've just said there, because that's exactly, obviously you and Michael Ford must talk a lot, because Michael, obviously he's in the forecasting business with his financial forecasting platform, and anybody watching this should link back to the discussion that we had a couple of months ago. But he said that forecasting, it's exactly what you just said. It's not about predicting the future. It's about mapping out various scenarios, and hopefully it's one of those scenarios that's unfold. So can you dive a little bit deeper into that for us?
Yeah. Look, to give you a really practical example, I'm working in a few weeks on a state level natural disaster exercise. So we're putting a scenario together to run a number of organisations through, and they'll be a mix of government agencies and private and publicly listed businesses. The scenario we're playing out is pretty much a worst case scenario natural disaster in a region of WA. And, there's no reason why that scenario couldn't happen. So far, it hasn't in history, but there's actually nothing stopping it from happening. When we get into that exercise, there'll be some people who want to argue the detail. They'll go, "Oh, that's unrealistic," or "What if it's X amount of rain versus Y amount of rain?" And they'll want to fight over the individual details. And the importance of scenario planning is actually not about that. It's more about what does this highlight for us. So if you're in a business at the moment that's kind of hanging on to the bar and you're wondering how long, then, in my mind, it's pretty prudent to go, okay, so if this doesn't stop, we, at the moment, our latest narrative is around the sort of 70 to 80% vaccinated and some of the freedoms that'll bring. I'm not convinced necessarily that that's any different to some of the previous narratives, like, we'll be out of this by Christmas or Easter, or some of the other timeframes that have been put on COVID over the 18 odd months we've been in the game. I reckon it's sensible to contemplate that worst case scenario and go, what would that look like and what would we have to do? It's hard. It's hard to do, it's painful to do that, but it gives you a sense of liberation and mental agility, I reckon, to contemplate those things.
I want to ask you.
I grew up in farming, and a lot of the old farmers used to say, plan for the worst, expect the best, and then accept what happens. And I think that's pretty good advice too.
Okay. Firstly, I just want to remind our live viewers that they can ask a question, and if they ask a good question, we will send them one of our lunch money mugs. We've got a bunch of them lined up, ready to send out for when our staff are back. When we were speaking earlier in the week about that Stockdale Paradox, can you just dive into that a little bit more? Because, you were saying that you're concerned about when we hit 80%, when we hit whatever it might be. And so we've got this, like I was talking to my personal trainer earlier this morning. He says, yep, the 18th of October, right? But and so we're putting this date in our mind, and you were concerned about that. Can you just tease out some of those Stockdale Paradox learnings a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So when Collins interviewed Stockdale, he asked him, Stockdale was first off talking about how you couldn't ever lose faith in the fact that you would prevail in the end in some way. And then Collins asks him who were the people who didn't survive, and Stockdale very quickly answered it was the optimists. And you can imagine hang on a minute, didn't you just say you needed to be optimistic? And that's when Stockdale made this point about, you've got to balance that sort of optimism, that faith that you will prevail, with confronting the brutal facts of your reality. And he said, and this has been borne out in a lot of the survival literature and research around, people who survive against the odds, they're very, very careful to look at the bits that are within their control. So as soon as we start to do things like, COVID will be done and dusted by Easter, COVID will be done and dusted by Christmas, we'll be able to travel again by whenever, if we get to 80% vaccination. In my mind, these are all attempts of humans to try and fill the gap of uncertainty. So if I can put a date on something, if I can say by the 18th of October, X will happen, that gives me a sense of comfort and certainty. But the risk of it is, if the 18th of October passes and nothing changes and or it gets worse, then that's actually an erosion of hope. So each time you pass an arbitrary marker, it's like we get weighed down again. The people who are handling lockdown, I've spoken to a lot of people in New South and in Victoria who are in, their sixth lockdown in Vic, and they're saying, if you come at that from the point of view of our last lockdown was the last one we were ever going to experience, then the next one is a mental assault. Whereas if you came at it from the point of view of we might have to do this again, then it's sort of not a surprise and you're mentally better prepared for it. So I think there's a risk of arbitrary numbers where we attach undue certainty to it. 70 to 80% and vaccination passports and all of that may well turn out to be a reality, and fantastic if it does. But in my mind, I'm also going, okay, what if that's not true? What if we hit that point and the reality is this is still grinding on and the freedoms that we hope for actually aren't there? I've got to be prepared to deal with that too.
I think it's interesting that you said the erosion of, did you say the erosion of confidence? I think you may have said.
The erosion of hope.
Of hope, the erosion of hope. It's interesting, in sales, I've done a lot of sales training, and there's this thing where you drip feed good news, because if I give you a little piece of good news early in our conversation, and then I drip feed you a little bit more good news, and your expectation is, oh, I wonder what other piece of good. But if I don't give you all the bad news up front, this is going to cost X. It's going to, these are all the pain points. I need to give you all of those in one go, because otherwise, if I give you a pain point now and then a pain point in 5 minutes, instead of you focusing on the good stuff, you're thinking, hang on a minute, why didn't you say that earlier? And you're only thinking about the next bad thing. You're now listening out for the next, the next gotcha or whatever it might be. There's a little bit of a crossover there in that psychology. Just going back to the Stockdale thing, is there any sort of cross-reference with, who was the guy that Stephen Covey talked about? Frankl?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, lots of cross-reference. So Frankl, I think, you can sum up, just for people that don't know, Frankl, he was incarcerated in Nazi Germany in one of the concentration camps. He was a doctor. So he did a lot to try and keep people happy and safe and well to the degree that he could under those very, very challenging circumstances. And he ultimately wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, where he said the people who were able to hang on to their sense of self and to choose their response to their circumstances were the ones that did the best. And one of my favourite quotes for him is, the last human freedom is the ability to choose how we respond to what's happening to us. That it's pretty powerful. For me, these are great frames of reference for what we're going through right now, because, I look at Stockdale's experience, I look at Frankl's experience. There's others as well. There's a number of people in that kind of space that have experienced the deepest, darkest pieces of what humans can do to each other, and certainly really, really challenging times physically, emotionally, psychologically. And they're all kind of saying the same thing. It's my headspace that made the difference. And if I'm looking to external circumstances, then I'm going to be on flimsy ground, because they're relatively unpredictable. The level of certainty is not high, and so if I look to that for certainty, then I'm on shaky ground.
Can I just ask you to just quickly repeat that ultimate learning of Frankl's just one more time? I think it's very powerful in these times.
Yeah. So he said the ultimate freedom of a human is their ability to choose their response to their circumstances.
Yeah, I think that, so Covey talks about his first habit of successful people is responsibility. It's choosing the response, isn't it? And so I guess that's where he talks about Frankl. And, it's interesting. I mean, God knows I've put on the kilos since this thing started, but we could sit at home eating tubs of ice cream and ordering pizza, or we could make the time useful, but I would say to any viewers, if you've got a question, fire them in. And I say that because we always get lots of questions just after we say goodbye. So get your questions in before we say goodbye. What I wanted to ask you was a couple of things. Firstly, you say, I'm looking at your LinkedIn profile here, where it says, in survival scenarios, people learn a massive amount about themselves, their habits, and their primeval reactions. And I wonder if you can talk about that again, just in the context of, say, a small business owner who's going through this.
Yeah. So look, one of the fundamental reactions that we've got completely hardwired into us, Nick, is that ancient fight or flight reaction. And, that's designed for dealing with immediate, short-term, genuine threats to life. So it's, the warring tribe from over the hill storming our village, or the saber-toothed tiger. In our modern context, it works really well if someone, tries to take our wallet in a car park, or, we're in the midst of a pile up on the freeway. That reaction's really, really good. But a lot of the evidence and data around it says that it shows up even in relatively mundane situations. Even something as safe as you and I talking here, when we start the conversation, there'll be a little bit of fight or flight active for you as you go, well, I hope this works out well. And for me, it's like, gee, I hope there's not going to be any questions that that I can't answer. And we're in that kind of little tic-tac all of the time. The problem with fight or flight is that it makes us measurably more stupid. Part of its purpose is to shut our frontal cortex down, because thinking is too slow in a genuinely life-threatening situation. So what that tends to mean is, we might be more aggressive than we would be otherwise, or more avoidant than we would be otherwise in a situation like an ongoing grind of COVID. Our adrenal response will be higher than it needs to be for the actual physicality of what we're facing. And all of that can result in less clear thinking with, the frontal cortex. Yep.
So how do you climb out of that? I'm thinking about, I've done the Myers-Briggs thing, and I tend to, under stress, I'm emotional as opposed to rational, right? So, I suppose, so that I can't remember what Brian Myers-Briggs type that makes me, but this is more or less what you're talking about. I guess it's the red mist. Yes. The trouble is that it's, you're not really aware that you're in this situation. You're sort of almost you're not thinking that you're not thinking, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
So how do you climb out of that?
So there's a few things that we can do in Thrive and Adapt, and a lot of the workshops around resilience that I do. I teach people a very, very simple 3-part tactic for getting out of that space that can be used anytime we make a transition. So if we're going into another meeting, or we're transitioning out of that into traffic and into and out of home, it applies at any of those points, and it kind of gets us back into a more settled, clear, present and focused state. So it's got 3 steps. The first step is to take 3 long, slow, rhythmic breaths. And the rhythm is the most important part of that. Rhythmic breathing literally shuts down all of the physiology of fight or flight. We can't breathe rhythmically and be in that state at the same time. And straight away, if you take rhythmic breaths, you notice that your level of mental clarity and your sense of calmness and being in control increases. The second step is to say how you feel out loud. And if you can do it out loud, that's good. Sometimes that's not appropriate or possible. You don't want to be walking into a hostile business negotiation going, I feel a little anxious. Probably not a good plan, in which case you just do it in your mind. But if you can do it out loud, there's something about the speed of speaking versus thinking that is very useful and effective in this space too. And that just acknowledges the emotional content of whatever we're currently in. It's not about getting into the story of the emotion. It's just quarantined. I feel happy, sad, angry, anxious, whatever it happens to be. And then the third thing is to say, what's my intention for what I'm focused on right now? So if I came out of, say immediately prior to this, I'd had a very difficult performance management conversation with somebody, and then I've got to be focused on this call, then I could take those 3 breaths and, I might feel frustrated or angry or disappointed from that conversation. My intent here is to convey what I know with the greatest clarity that I can. And so it just helps me transition from one thing to another. And if I do that through all of the transitions that I make, it's a very, very good way of keeping yourself out of that reactive space.
Okay, so three rhythmic breaths, state how you're feeling, and what is my intention. Now, we've got a question here from Ryan Hodges. Ryan asks, on your website for Thrive and Adapt book, you talk about the idea that they do relentlessly actions that set the scene for success. Assuming you are talking about leaders, can you please talk through the good examples you have seen in relation to this piece, please? So
I think great question. Thanks, Ryan. There's layers of this. So, at the layer of our own individual success, we've already hinted at a few of those, Nick, with you talking about one reaction to COVID could be sit on the couch and eat a heap of ice cream and Tim Tams. So one of the things that we can do is look after our own habits of success physically, so I know that there's certain things that I can eat, sleep patterns that I can adopt, morning mindfulness routines, those kinds of things that actually set my day up for a greater probability of success. And then when it comes to leading business, we talked offline as well, Nick, about the notion of command the narrative. So intentionally telling the story of who we are as a business and as a team, and how we do our work, and particularly for the moment, how we're facing the current reality around us. Good leaders are very, very good at continuously building a sense of psychological safety for their team. So, we can operate together in effective ways without too much risk of blame games, ego, gossip, undermining each other. They work really hard on that. Leadership teams that work really effectively have robust discussion leading up to a decision, and then once a decision is made, one of the leaders I interviewed for Unshakable said it's like once the decision's made, it's like there's no daylight between us. We're 100% aligned. So There's that sort of guarantee of we actively are supporting each other out there once we're on the backside of a decision.
Can you give an example without necessarily naming names? I've often, I know this is only this is a little bit obtuse, but I often thought that the Roy and HG, you're right, those guys never criticised each other. There was never negative. They were always reinforcing each other and calling each other brilliant. And I know that was part of the shtick, but I think it was also, those guys, I mean, they're still going now, and they were around a long time, and it was always they were always building each other up. Again, I know it was part of the routine, but I'm also sure it's part of the secret of their success as well. So have you got? Can you think of an example where you're talking about that? I guess at the end, there's not a paper, difference when people are making those critical decisions.
Yeah, look, there's a number. I interviewed around about 20 leaders for the Unshakable book, and a number of those spoke about a couple of things. So one was the ability to celebrate success and have a disposition of gratitude, whatever was going on. And that kind of, echoes really strongly back to Stockdale and to Viktor Frankl as well. That sort of sense of, however difficult this is, we feel a sense of gratitude for what we're doing and for the people around us. And then the second thing is that they build levels of trust so that when we're having debate, I can call you on your opinion or point of view on something, but I do that in a way that we're actually talking about the opinion or point of view rather than I'm criticising you.
Right.
And there's a sense of what we're trying to do is make our decision more robust, not fight each other.
Right.
And then, if we do that well, then at the point that we actually go out and execute that decision, while the decision might be different to what I would have personally chosen, and I might not necessarily fully fully agree with how it's been made, I will completely back it. And it's that real discipline to say, okay, once we've decided, you know, I guess the opposite of it is you see organisations where, you know, we'll get together as a leadership team, we'll discuss something.
Yeah.
And at face value, we all agree. We go, yep, that's decision made. We agree. But then out in the corridors, we're going, oh, bloody hell, you know, here we go again. We've been steamrolled by somebody. Or we'll go back to the team that we lead and we'll say, look, I went into bat for you fellas. You know, we tried, but bloody management's overridden us again. And now we've got to wear this crap. And it's essentially seeding messages of discord and disagreement.
All right, listen.
That result in us pointing the finger at each other and going, the problems we're facing are, you know, because of these other idiots, not us.
Well, the other thing is, of course, that if you're trying to lead a team, and they think that the two leaders are divided, you know, they can then all pick teams within a team. Look, the clock is running down severely, and you know, I'm going to make an exception. We're going to go for an extra couple of minutes because there's two things I absolutely have to ask you. One is you talk about incomplete information. So when you were, I think this is possible. Well, actually, it's in your latest LinkedIn post. So go to Mike's LinkedIn feed, and in your latest LinkedIn post, you talk about incomplete information is a permanent feature of our current reality. Sometimes it's a product of complexity. There's so much to understand. Can you just, you know, in a nutshell, just tell us something about that incomplete information, and maybe how, you know, small business people are in this pandemic, you know, and how that concept works.
Yeah, so look, this was probably the biggest lever I had at my disposal as a survival instructor, was I'd give people accurate but incomplete information. And because humans are storytelling machines, really, we can't help but create narrative. We fill the gaps. If we don't know the answer, we fill the gaps. And, you know, this loops back to some of the stuff we've been talking about regarding the COVID situation, where, you know, we'll clutch at things like 70 to 80% or the 18th of October or those kinds of potential milestones where, you know, the evidence isn't necessarily there or the picture's not complete. You know, part of the challenge with the 70 to 80% is all the modelling for that is around, that I'm aware of at least, is around, you know, impacts on the medical system and on hospitals and death rates and things like that. It's not really looking at the full freedoms of movement and things like that we were used to prior to COVID. So, you know, there's calls being made on incomplete information. We can't help but fill the gaps. And I think it's worth being consciously aware of what do we know for sure, and where are we sort of painting in between the actual evidence to create a sense of complete story and certainty.
Look, we are out of time. I know I've seen people in action on whiteboards look at stuff, and there's a bunch of stuff we don't know, but making, you know, there is a fine art to making educated guesses as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'm sure we could talk about that. Look, we are running out of time. I'm interested in your two books. Where can people get them, and how are they different?
So if they jumped onto my website, which is just mikehouse.com.au, both books are available there. Thrive and Adapt is primarily about tactics at a sort of individual level to deal with uncertainty and pressure. And Unshakable is really addressed to leaders and leadership teams about the territory we've been talking about today. How do you create a sense of certainty when everything around you is uncertain? So that's the difference between the two.
Fantastic. Well, we will put a link to mikehouse.com.au in the socials when we do a summary of today's episode. So you'll see those on Facebook, LinkedIn, and on YouTube. And I will having said that, I will remind everybody to share, like, and subscribe to our podcast. Mike, just any sort of closing words?
Nick, thanks very much for the invite. And yeah, I guess the last thing I would say is that it's time spent thinking about what future possibilities might look like, both good and bad, is never time wasted. just don't get locked into any of them as being, this is certainly what will happen.
Fantastic. All right. Well, that's a great way to finish up, Mike. I'm very grateful to you for coming on. It's been fascinating. I was very excited from when I first saw your website when Michael Ford said you really should talk to Mike House. So it's been a privilege to have you on. Thank you very much to all of our viewers live and to our podcast listeners. And we'll do it all again next week. Cheers.